Hello, everyone, and welcome to the NGM Network News, Geopolitics, and more. Today, I'm going to talk about a war that many of us should be concerned about if it breaks out. The hypothetical war I will talk about is a Sino-American war. Now, I feel like with the current events in the world that's going on, with all the tension and conflicts, we as Americans should research into this and really be concerned about this. I'm not saying that we should worry all day about it, that we should just, lose our minds over it, but we should research this. So, what do I mean when I say a Sino-American war? Well, as you know, China wants Taiwan. However, the U.S. is not going to let China take Taiwan. It's going to do everything in its power to defend Taiwan. And that could lead America and China to a conflict. Now, I feel like this conflict could happen possibly in December of 2025. Whether it happens at that time or not, I'm not entirely sure, but I'm just giving out a date. And maybe this conflict doesn't happen at all. Maybe China doesn't invade Taiwan. Maybe it uses some peaceful means to resolve this dispute. But we can never be too sure of that. So, with that being said, I'm going to show you a map I've created on what this hypothetical war would look like. So this is the map that I've created of a hypothetical Sino-American war. In the blue colored countries, you have America and its allies. There's the USA, there's Australia, Canada, the UK, New Zealand, Guyana, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Kuwait, the Philippines, Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan. And then you have China and its allies. There's China, North Korea, Iran, Iraq, Yemen, aka the Houthis, Lebanon, aka Hezbollah, Egypt, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. Now, contrary to popular belief, I don't think a Sino-American war starts with China invading Taiwan. No, China knows that it would be difficult enough for it to invade Taiwan, not including the U.S. even helping Taiwan. And so, if this war is only between China, Taiwan, and the U.S., then I believe the U.S. would successfully repel China out of Taiwan. That is why that I believe China will wait for the U.S. to be stuck in another conflict, such as Latin America, for example. And we already have high tensions with Venezuela running right now. And so, before I get back to China, I want to explain how this scenario starts. So let's say the tensions in Venezuela, they continue. The U.S. Navy gets closer to the shores of Venezuela, and Maduro, trying to prove that he's strong on the international world stage, decides to send more Venezuelan fighter jets over U.S. Navy ships. This turns into a back and forth where U.S. Navy ships get closer to Venezuela and Venezuelan fighter jets get closer to U.S. Navy ships. This turns into a cycle until one day there's a breaking point and a Venezuelan fighter jet gets too close to a U.S. Navy ship and gets shot down. Now, it's this point which the U.S. and Venezuela are on the brink of war. Now, Maduro has two possible options. One, he can back down. He can, pull his fighter jets back, pull from the U.S. Navy ships, and he can take the humiliation on the world stage but avoid war with the U.S. Or option two, he can dig in even further. He can fly even more fighter jets over U.S. Navy ships and increase the tension to try to not make himself look weak. Now, it's most likely that Maduro will choose option one because he will not want a war with the U.S. However, in this scenario, China encourages Maduro to keep up pressure against the United States. Why is China doing this? Well, as I said earlier, China needs the U.S. to be stuck in another conflict before it's confident that it can invade Taiwan. So, China, aka Xi Jinping, he tells Maduro that he should continue flying fighter jets over U.S. Navy ships, that China will send material, equipment, money, anything Venezuela needs to Venezuela in order to deter the Americans. Maduro, being a dictator and not having many people willing to say no to him, decides that he's going to continue the tension with the U.S. He's going to continue this game of chicken, and he's going to see who backs down first. Well, this leads to a dangerous situation because the U.S. isn't going to back down from Venezuela. That would make it seem like a joke on the world stage. That if Venezuela is able to get the U.S. to back down, then a stronger country, like let's say, I don't know, Iran or Russia or even possibly North Korea, could also get the U.S. to back down. If Venezuela can do it, then so could they. So the U.S. is not going to back down. And eventually, this leads to another Venezuelan fighter jet getting shot down. Now Maduro, at this point, meets with the other Latin American leaders in America's backyard that are against the U.S. That's being Cuba and Nicaragua. And he signs an alliance with them. Now you might ask, what does Cuba and Nicaragua gain from signing an alliance with Venezuela? Well, they actually don't gain much. But the leaders of Cuba and Nicaragua, they decide to side with Venezuela in this sort of undeclared war that's not really a war yet, but it's not peace either. They decide to side with Venezuela in order to assert themselves on the world stage and in order to put the U.S. in a corner. But that's not the only reason. Michael Diaz-Canel, the leader of Cuba, and Daniel Ortega, the leader of Nicaragua, they start thinking. In this scenario, they fear that if Venezuela's dictator is toppled, then they could be next. And so, they might as well try to stand with Venezuela now and possibly get the U.S. to back off, then wait for Venezuela to be toppled, and then they get toppled next. So Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba all sign an alliance. And Venezuela states in the alliance that any American aggression against Venezuela would be American aggression against Cuba and Nicaragua as well. So it's at this point that the situation is just tenser than it's ever been in decades. And finally, it reaches a breaking point. A Venezuelan fighter jet flying over a U.S. Navy ship gets too close, and the cycle is about to repeat itself. The U.S. Navy is about to shoot it down when, by surprise, a Venezuelan drone ends up exploding on the U.S. Navy ship. Now, the drone's explosion, it damages the ship. It doesn't kill any sailors, but it's a clear sign from Venezuela that they are willing to escalate against the U.S. And it's at this point that the U.S. has to respond. It can't just let Venezuela hit its ships with a drone and get away with it. And so, in a response, the U.S. Air Force flies over Venezuela. It starts doing targeted hits on Venezuelan government buildings, facilities, and strategic locations. And it's at this point that Maduro gives a 72-hour ultimatum to the U.S. Either stop the bombings or Venezuela will rightfully take back rightfully take back its territory that was stolen from it in Guyana. Now, Maduro has just put the U.S. in a corner. By threatening Guyana, Maduro brings another country into this basically, I want to say, well, it's not a full-scale war yet, but it's a conflict. And by threatening Guyana, the situation gets more complex. Now, Maduro could be bluffing. He could be just making these threats against Guyana up to just make himself seem strong. However, American leaders, and Donald Trump especially, they're going to take this threat very seriously. At the same time, they can't afford to back down from Venezuela on the world stage. Again, it would make them seem weak. And for one reason or another in this scenario, diplomacy fails, and both sides will not talk to each other. And so the U.S. keeps up its strikes against Venezuela, and the 72-hour period passes. It's at this point that Venezuela authorizes its invasion of Guyana. Venezuelan troops on ships start naval invasions in the north of Guyana, and Venezuelan paratroopers drop in Guyanese territory, and a war with Venezuela and Guyana begins. Now, the U.S. has to respond. It can no longer sit and wait to see what happens, or just wait to see what Venezuela does next. The U.S. gives its own ultimatum to Venezuela. Leave Guyana within 24 hours or face the full wrath of the United States Armed Forces. Now, Maduro would likely back down at this point in a normal scenario. He knows there's not much he's going to be able to do against the U.S. Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force, and possibly even Space Force. But, again, this is where China comes in. China tells, always Xi Jinping, again, he tells Maduro that he'll give them all the equipment, money, and arms that he needs to fight the U.S. And even though Maduro wouldn't be making a good decision in trying to test the U.S. and trying to see whether or not it will protect Guyana. He decides that, he has the backing of Xi Jinping, that, he can invade Guyana and the U.S. won't do anything about it, that Trump is just bluffing on his threat to go to war with Venezuela. And remember, the U.S. had been in war for 20 years in the Middle East. And Maduro knows the American population is tired of war. So he's betting that he can take some border regions of Guyana as long as he doesn't go too far into Guyana, and the Americans won't do much about it other than possibly bomb him a little bit more. However, Maduro is wrong, and unfortunately, in this scenario, Maduro likely won't be surrounded by people who are going to go against him. Again, Maduro is a dictator. People who have gone against him or opposed him, they either end up exiled from the country, in prison, or dead. So Maduro is surrounded by yes men, and they're too scared to say that his incursions into Guyana are too risky. So the 24-hour period passes. It's at this point Trump mobilizes the U.S. Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force, and he mobilizes them to go into Guyana and to repel the Venezuelan invasion. It's also at this same point that Cuba and Nicaragua declare their support for Venezuela and declare that any American action against Venezuela is American action against them. Again, they've signed an alliance with Venezuela, and although the leaders of Cuba and Nicaragua know they can't do much to the U.S., and they won't be able to win against the U.S., their first hope is that the U.S. decides it's either too risky to invade them, and it's not worth it, or that if their countries do fall to the U.S., they can escape possibly to either Venezuela or China. And in this scenario, China gives the three leaders of these Latin American countries that are against the U.S. promises that if their countries fall to the U.S., then they can have safe exile in China for the rest of their life. So with this promise, they are more confident than ever in going against the U.S. And the U.S. has just gotten itself into a Latin American war. And China would be very ecstatic about this. But I don't think that would be enough for China to immediately invade Taiwan after. They need the U.S. stuck in multiple conflicts before they can even think about invading Taiwan. So, 2 days after America gets into a war with Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua, China asks Iran if it can stir up things in the Middle East to get America distracted. And Iran happily obliges. Now, there's a lot Iran wants to do in the Middle East, but has been blocked by America and Israel from doing. However, China encourages Iran at this point to take advantage of the U.S. of America's temporary distraction in Latin America to stir up trouble in the Middle East. So let's say, anywhere from 2 to 3 days after America gets into war in Latin America, Iran stirs up trouble in the Middle East again. The first thing they do is they covertly send the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps into Iraq. Now, Iran already has the IRGC in Iraq. However, they covertly send them in this scenario, and they start sending more of them to slowly start a coup against the Iraqi government. Now, it's important to note, the U.S. does have soldiers still in Iraq, about 35,000, I think, but in this scenario, the Iranians try to work as covertly as possible, and they want to give the element of surprise to the Americans. Now, I think America would know what Iraq is doing, and they would keep an eye on what's happening in the Middle East as well as what's happening in East Asia as well with Taiwan. However, with China not immediately acting on Taiwan, there's not much America could do with Taiwan and China. Because again, China will do its best to seem like it's not doing anything to invade Taiwan. Russia, when it invaded Ukraine in 2022, it lost its element of surprise because satellite images showed Russian troops and tanks and artillery pieces and the equipment on the Ukrainian-Russian border, which gave away its element of surprise. I don't think China is going to start assembling its soldiers, marines, ships, and air force until the very last second. But let's get back to the Middle East. Now we have Iran, which is starting to slowly infiltrate Iraq and going to try to coup the Iraqi government. And at the same time, the Iranians decide to try to coup Egypt. Now, why Egypt, you ask? Well, several reasons. One, possibly the most important reason, Egypt controls the Suez Canal. That accounts for the trade going to Europe to Asia and oil coming from the Middle East to Europe, and just very important for not only Europe but the USA as well. But the secondary reason is that Egypt shares a direct border with Israel. You see, the Iranian proxy of Hezbollah in Lebanon, although it shares a border with Israel, it's been significantly weakened. And Hamas has been pretty much nearly completely devastated by the Gaza war. Meanwhile, the Houthis in Lebanon, they're not in Lebanon. The Houthis in Yemen don't even share a border with Israel. And they can send missiles to Israel, but they're not nearly as effective as, let's say, Hezbollah missiles would be in Lebanon. However, Egypt would be a game changer. Egypt shares a direct border with Israel, and Egypt would be a massive threat to Israel because of its population. I forget what the exact Egyptian population is, but I'm pretty sure the last I checked, it was 130 million, I think. That number might be a little off, but all I know is the Egyptian population massively outnumbers the Israeli population. And so you're probably thinking, how is Iran going to successfully pull off a coup in Egypt? And that's a good question, because Egypt right now is led by a pro-Western dictator. Well, that could change easily. You see, Egypt's population is located mostly on the Nile River, and with the Egyptian revolution of 2011, with the Egyptian population being so tightly packed in the same area, they were easily able to overwhelm the Egyptian government and military with sheer numbers alone, which led to the Muslim Brotherhood taking control of Egypt from 2011 to 2013. Now, the Egyptian army couped the Muslim Brotherhood and overthrew them, which led to al-Sisi, the pro-Western dictator, taking control in Egypt. However, I think the Muslim Brotherhood could make a resurgence. And the reason why I say this is because Israel's war in Gaza has angered many Arabs in the surrounding Arabic states. And many Arabic leaders seem like Western puppets to their population. And I feel like as the longer the Gaza war goes on, the more angry and more desperate Arab populations will be to try to get involved in the war in Gaza against Israel and on the side of the Palestinians. So far, Egypt has been kept, a second Egyptian revolution has been kept at bay because America supplies Egypt with money, and a cold peace between Egypt and Israel exists. But I think in a scenario that has America even the slightest bit distracted from what's going on in the Middle East or in Egypt, Iran will pounce on that opportunity and throw everything they have at trying to get the Muslim Brotherhood in power in Egypt again. And although I don't think it's a definite on whether they could, I don't think they would have a definite success on trying to get the Muslim Brotherhood back into power in Egypt. I think they would have a good chance, especially if America got into a Latin American war. Now again, as I said, Iran starts doing these things 2 to 4 days after America gets into the war of Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. And right now, even on this very day, Egypt has been facing instability. Even before the war in Gaza began, Egyptians have been dealing with higher food prices. They've been dealing with tensions over Ethiopia, over the Ethiopian Jared Dam, which I should probably make a different video about. And Egyptians have been facing a lot of pressure from the government. So, you have a lot of Egyptians that are secretly angry at the government, but likely are too afraid to try to speak out against it, because you can get arrested in Egypt if you speak out against the government. And they're likely too afraid to protest against it because they don't want to be shot. However, let's say in this scenario, Iran gets the perfect once-in-a-lifetime chance to coup Egypt. Let's say al-Sisi, he ends up ordering the Egyptian military to enforce order in the Egyptian cities, and he ends up officially announcing that all functions of the Egyptian government, every single last one of them, will be moved to the new capital in the east. Now, for those of you who don't know, the Egyptians have built a new capital. The Egyptian government built a new capital in the east of Egypt, away from Cairo. They did this because, as I said earlier, the Egyptian population is mostly located on the Nile. And with so many people in the same place, the Egyptian government was overwhelmed and overthrown by Egyptian protesters in 2011. But in this scenario, only 2 to 4 days after America gets into the Latin American war, al-Sisi decides he wants to keep his country as stable as possible, and he wants to avoid anything, happening in the Middle East. However, in this scenario, it backfires. The Egyptian population see him as abandoning the Egyptian civilians to their fate. They see him as living in an ivory tower while all of them suffer. So when he announces this, that the Egyptian capital is being immediately moved, and he sends a military out to make sure that no riots begin and that no protest begins, because he's trying to solve a problem before it even begins, his plan ends up backfiring. Massive protests begin against al-Sisi. People are calling for him to be executed in the streets, they begin fighting against the Egyptian government. And the Egyptian military loses control of the situation. Although Al-Sisi is in the eastern capital at this point, the Egyptian military is quickly, losing control of Cairo, and some in the Egyptian military are even defecting and joining the protesters. The reason being is because they've been fed up with Al-Sisi for doing nothing during the Israel's war in Gaza, and they feel like Egypt should do more to help the Palestinians. Al-Sisi is quickly surprised at the sheer ferocity of the protesters, and with his own military beginning to join the protesters, he declares absolute martial law in Egypt, and he declares that if the protesters don't follow a curfew by 9 p.m., that they can be executed by Egyptian military forces. This extreme measure is to try to put the Egyptian population into submission, but it ends up backfiring. Now, Al-Sisi has lost most of the support from regular Egyptians, and now he's isolated in the eastern capital away from Cairo. It's at this point that a Muslim Brotherhood infiltrator assassinates Al-Sisi in the eastern capital, just like Anwar Sadat was assassinated. Now, and the reason why a Muslim Brotherhood member was able to infiltrate into the eastern capital is because Al-Sisi's guards were radicalized by Israel's war in Gaza. This bodyguard of his secretly harbored feelings of hatred towards Israel and deep admiration for the Palestinians, and when Egypt did nothing to help Gaza, that started his hate of Israel. And so, this bodyguard was pushed towards his breaking point once he sees Al-Sisi calling for the death of Egyptian protesters and decides to assassinate him. And that's how Al-Sisi gets assassinated. Now, it's at this point that Iranian agents fully start to release Muslim Brotherhood officials from prison in Egypt and call for the Muslim Brotherhood to rule Egypt again. And I haven't mentioned Iranian agents yet, but that's on purpose. It's because while the Egyptian protests were going on, the Iranian agents were working in the background to undermine the Egyptian government. Some secretly dressed up as Egyptian police and fired on Egyptian protesters on purpose to get tensions in Egypt at a boiling point to where Al-Sisi could be overthrown. And so some Iranian agents were agitators in the Egyptian protests as well. And so they've been working in the background to ensure that Al-Sisi gets overthrown. And this is a perfect gift to Iran. Al-Sisi has just been assassinated by a member of the Muslim Brotherhood who managed to infiltrate into Al-Sisi's presidential guard. With this, the Iranian agents act less covertly and more in the open. They begin to free Muslim Brotherhood members from prison, and swiftly, within hours, a Muslim Brotherhood council takes control of Egypt and immediately declares that Egyptian soldiers will go into Gaza to save the Palestinian population from Israel. Now, this puts the Middle East at a flashpoint. Israel is not going to tolerate Egyptian soldiers in Gaza. But Egypt isn't going to back down under the new Muslim Brotherhood Council that rules it. So Israel and Egypt are at an impasse, and you have Iran in the background secretly encouraging Egypt to be even more aggressive against Israel. And don't forget as well, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps in this scenario are covertly operating in Iraq, but as soon as the Muslim Brotherhood solidifies its control over Egypt, they act less covertly. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps pushes full steam ahead in Iraq, and the Iranian army goes into Iraq as well, which would be unprecedented, because the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps is the main way Iran influences Iraq. But for the Iranian army itself to go into Iraq would be seen as a full-scale either invasion of Iraq or a full-scale takeover of Iraq. This doesn't go unnoticed by the Americans. And remember, to recap, in this scenario, America has been at war with Venezuela for about 2 to 3 days now, and the Middle East has just flipped upside down, essentially. Egypt is in control of the Muslim Brotherhood, and so is the Suez Canal in control of a Muslim Brotherhood nation. So America will not let this happen. As soon as the Iranian army itself begins going into Iraq, America orders its soldiers to fight against the Iranians and fight against any allied Iranian Iraqi militias. The Americans begin finding anti-Iranian militias in Iraq, like the Kurds possibly, or any other Iraqi militias that do not like Iran. And so a full-scale war, a civil war breaks out in Iraq between pro-Iran factions and pro-American factions. Meanwhile, in Egypt has the new Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood leaders fully express their desire to go into Gaza, and they begin going into Gaza. And so Egypt and Israel are now at war with each other at the Sinai. But Iran isn't finished yet. Iran tells Hezbollah and the Houthis and what remains of Hamas to go against Israel with everything they have. And although Hezbollah has been severely degraded by Israel, it still poses threats to Israel. And you have the Houthis, who have been very resilient against America, Israel, and Saudi Arabia. And they begin attacking Israeli and American ships in the Bab al-Mandeb Strait. So Israel is now at war with Egypt, what remains of Hezbollah and the Houthis. But Iran still isn't finished yet. With everything going on in Iraq, Iran decides this is the time for it to try to dominate as much as the Middle East as it can, while the U.S. is trying to fight in Latin America. So, Iran officially declares a jihad against what they would call the infidels. Iran declares that Israel, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia are all infidels, that they are against the Islamic faith and that they need to be completely dominated and just completely taken over so that they can experience what is, in Iran's eyes, true Islam. And although Saudi Arabia and Kuwait are Islamic countries as well, one is Shia and one is Sunni. So there's still plenty of religious tension for Iran to exploit. Now, this is just going to throw the region into even more chaos. For one, Kuwait is a vital oil producer, and America cannot afford to let it fall into Iranian hands, because in 1991, when Iraq invaded Kuwait, America had a fierce response to that invasion because Iraq would have controlled a major supplier of the global oil. But now, with America and Latin America, things have changed. America can still send forces to the Middle East, but at the same time, America is also keeping an eye on China to see what it's doing. So it has to be very careful about which forces they send where. And America right now, well, not right now, but right now in this scenario, is throwing everything they have, not at Venezuela, not at Nicaragua, but surprisingly at Cuba. Why are they doing this, you ask? It's because of Guantanamo Bay. Guantanamo Bay is a U.S. military base and prison in southeastern Cuba, and the Americans under Trump in this scenario are trying to send every resource they can to Guantanamo Bay to prevent it from falling. Now, if Cuba takes Guantanamo Bay, it's not like that would be some sort of major victory for Cuba. Like, the next thing they would be able to do is invade the U.S. from Florida and then just go all the way to Washington, D.C. But it's more of a morale thing. It would be a massive propaganda victory for Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela if Cuba is able to take over Guantanamo Bay and capture all the American soldiers stationed there. So that is why America would try to throw everything at Cuba first, just to prevent Guantanamo Bay from being captured. So with America still in Latin America going towards Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, Iran has just taken advantage of that and declared a holy war against Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. Now, the American forces already stationed in Iraq would be fighting the Iranians, the IRGC, the pro-Iraqi militias, and American forces also stationed in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia would be fighting against the Iraqis and Iranians as well. And honestly, this war would be very chaotic because Iran would likely fracture Iraq at this point, and Iraq would return to what it was like in the early to mid 2000s of just sectarian violence and just constant insurgencies everywhere. In Kuwait and Saudi Arabia would do their best to go on the defensive against Iran and Iraq. So any American soldiers in Europe or in Turkey, they're probably going to get called to defend Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. And you might think that Russia would be able to take advantage of this, and I haven't talked about Russia yet. And there's a reason why I haven't included them, and that reason is simple. Russia is stuck in Ukraine right now, and for the foreseeable future, they still will be stuck in the Ukrainian war. So, in this scenario, although America starts moving some of its troops away from Europe and into the Middle East, Russia still can't take advantage of it because they're still stuck in Ukraine. So going back, we have Iran, Iraq, some of Lebanon, which would be Hezbollah, Egypt, Hamas in Palestine, the Houthis in Yemen against Israel, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia. And in a normal situation, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait, with American help, would be able to easily push out the IRGC and any of their militias and go on the offensive. But again, America is in a Latin American war. And this doesn't cause the U.S. to completely be distracted and just shocked at this, but America has been putting their American resources would start to become split and under pressure, just to say the least. And it's at this point China sees as their opportunity, their once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. They have Iran, which has flipped Egypt to their side and has gotten the Suez Canal closed to America. And they have Latin America, which has distracted the U.S., which is, and Cuba is right next to the U.S., 90 miles away. And so they decide they won't get an opportunity like this again to invade Taiwan. So let's say a mere 6 hours after the Middle East war starts, China orders North Korea to invade the South. And again, China hasn't even done anything to Taiwan yet. They just want to create as much, or they want to create or encourage as much wars as possible before they invade Taiwan. So, North Korea declares war against South Korea. Kim Jong-un declares he's going to reunify the Korean Peninsula by force, whether the South Koreans accept him or not. It's at this point that Japan, Australia, and New Zealand immediately join the war against North Korea. And another thing I forgot to mention, the UK. Now, I think the UK, I should have mentioned this in the Middle East section, but the UK definitely will join America in its war in the Middle East again. Even if, so the 2003 war in Iraq wasn't popular at all. Most European countries rejected America's claims about Iraq having weapons of mass destruction, and most of them sat out of it. However, the UK didn't. The UK has always been a very close ally of the USA ever since World War II. So I think as soon as Iran starts messing with Iraq, as soon as Iran goes into Kuwait, the UK is going to join America's side, as well as possibly Canada joining America's side in the Middle East. I don't know if the Canadian population would be too eager to join America in another Middle Eastern war, but I do know that as soon as South Korea starts getting invaded by North Korea, Canada is going to join America in defending South Korea. So, back to the Korean Peninsula. North Korea invades South Korea. And this is just a mere 6 or 8 hours after the Middle East war has begun. And it's at this point that China sees the opportunity to invade Taiwan. After just one day of North Korea invading South Korea, China begins its invasion of Taiwan. They begin bombing Taiwan with their fighter jets, hitting it with cruise missiles, hitting it with naval missiles. But the thing is that China hasn't prepared to invade Taiwan at all. It doesn't have a massive buildup on its coast. It doesn't have a massive buildup of ships or marines on its coast. And they've done that on purpose to avoid detection of invading Taiwan until the last minute. And now China is sending its fighters, its bombers to Taiwanese airspace to cause as much damage as possible before they try to invade. Now China is preparing itself to invade Taiwan. They concentrating their marines near the Taiwanese coast. Near the Chinese coast to invade the Taiwanese coast. But this raises its own problem. Because China hasn't concentrated its forces yet, they are still not as organized as they could be. And this leads to Taiwan having more time to prepare themselves for the Chinese invasion. Because China obviously can't just invade Taiwan with forces that aren't even prepared to breach the shores of Taiwan yet. You also have the Philippines. And as soon as China starts striking Taiwan, they're going to strike the Philippines as well. Because America is going to respond to this. Even if America is in a war in Latin America and the Middle East at the same time, America will do everything in their power to protect Taiwan. So even if America has to neglect some of the fighting in Guyana, neglect some of the fighting in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, it's still going to make sure that, first and foremost, Taiwan gets protected and that South Korea also gets protection as well from America. So now the full-scale Sino-American War has begun. And now going deeper into this, and I also forgot to mention, I'm pretty sure I mentioned Australia joining America, but New Zealand is going to join America in this war as well. Because New Zealand already has a close relationship with Australia, the UK and Canada. They're all in the Anglosphere, and if Australia is joining in the war against China, New Zealand is going to as well. But Taiwan is... Okay. After China attacks Taiwan, this marks the beginning of the Sino-American War. Every other war that has happened in the scenario leading up to the Taiwanese War, leading up to the Chinese invasion of Taiwan, was just a prelude to things. That was just a prelude to the Sino-American War. Venezuela invading Guyana, Iran taking control of Iraq and invading Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, and Egypt being cooped by Iran and being led by the Muslim Brotherhood. All of that was as a distraction. Now, although China wasn't directly behind most of what happened, they did encourage this in this scenario. And so China waited until they had the perfect opportunity to invade Taiwan. They waited even for North Korea. They waited and ordered North Korea to attack South Korea before invading. And I don't know if I mentioned Japan yet, but Japan definitely gets involved as soon as North Korea invades South Korea. And so you have the true, what could possibly be described as World War III beginning. Now again, on the American side, you have America, Canada, the UK, Guyana, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Kuwait, Taiwan, the Philippines, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and South Korea. And on the Chinese side, you have China, Iran, Iraq, the Houthis, which is Yemen, Hezbollah, which is southern Lebanon. You have Egypt, Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and North Korea. But I want to talk about countries before I end this video that would be likely neutral in this war. Firstly, we have India. You might ask, why would India be neutral? Wouldn't they take the golden opportunity of China being at war with the US, Taiwan, and South Korea to try to attack China? And the answer is no. one way I can give you why India wouldn't try to attack China. Pakistan. If India attacks China, Pakistan gets involved. And really, India doesn't have much to gain from fighting China for America's sake, only to get into a war with Pakistan. Pakistan also possesses nuclear weapons, and it's not the most stable country. So if Pakistani leaders are concerned that they're going to fall to India, they are going to use nuclear weapons on India. And India would be best suited just staying neutral on this. China and Pakistan also have a close relationship. And although Pakistan has a good relationship with the U.S. as well, in a scenario in which India gets involved against China and the U.S. is at war with China, there's a chance that Pakistan might choose China over the U.S. And again, this is all hypothetical. We don't know what would actually happen, but I think for this reason, India is going to stay neutral. Now, I already explained why Russia would stay neutral. It has its own problems. Ukraine is... they stuck in the Ukrainian quagmire, and for the foreseeable future, they still will be stuck in Ukraine. So Russia won't be able to take advantage of most of this. Then you have the European countries in NATO. And you might ask, wouldn't they help with Taiwan, even if they don't help with the Latin American conflict or the Middle East? And I have to say, they likely wouldn't help America and Taiwan. France, especially, under Macron, has already said that France is not a vassal of the U.S., and Europe has been trying to say its independence from the U.S. The only other European country that I can even think of that might join America in this war is Poland, but it has its own problems with Belarus. And Europe as a whole would not like to get pulled into a conflict that doesn't really actively threaten them, like Belarus or Russia does. So I just don't see Europe just getting involved on behalf of America, especially if America isn't directly attacked first in this conflict. Then we have Brazil. Now, although Brazil is led by a currently left-leaning government, and I forgot the Brazilian president's name. Someone will probably mention it in the comments to me. Was it? Anyways, I forgot the Brazilian president's name, but although the leader of Brazil has a left-leaning government and has been sympathetic to Venezuela in the past, it's likely not going to join Venezuela because the Brazilian government doesn't have much to gain antagonizing America, and China also doesn't have much to offer to Brazil that the Americans can't offer to Brazil. And getting involved in a major war wouldn't be good for the Brazilian economy, the Brazilian populace. In Brazil, the leaders of Brazil know that they're better off staying neutral and not choosing sides. So, there you have it. A possible Sino-American war. And I hope this never happens, that this never comes to pass. But again, I can't tell you that this won't happen. I have a feeling that even if a Sino-American war doesn't happen like this, that it still has a very high chance of happening, more than anyone wants to admit. But anyways, I'm thankful that you watched my video. Please like and subscribe if you can, and have a amazing rest of your day.